So for instance, in improv and improvisation, which I love, I just love using improv in so much of my work. Improv is so important to be a fierce listener to your partner and listening with all synapses open, all sensors open. And in improv, one of the main tenets is it's not your job to be brilliant, it's your job to make your partner brilliant. Well, for me, it moves the work forward.
Yeah.
And it's not, it doesn't get rested in me, and I don't have to be brilliant. And it allowed, and part of improv too, and may I say life, is about giving your partner gifts. So the
Yeah.
more gifts I give in improv, the more they have to work with, and the more we can create in the moment. So I think it's about staying in the moment and not trying to drive the narrative to
Mhm.
some preconceived notion. And sometimes we might do that even in life. My life should be like this. My partner should be like this. And how many times is it not like that? Almost always. So how do we do that?
Right.
I think using improv tenets can make having a beautiful life more easy.
Emmett, what do you think? What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm, certainly at a place in my career artistically where I can't really get excited about uh, creating art non-collaboratively. I'll take moments to go off and work on something and then come back to the table. But I like working with folks on things. I sort of romanticize the idea of a good writer's room
Mm,
because it sort of becomes more than the sum of its parts, or the thing that you end up creating, because everyone's bringing something unique to the table that no one else has. In a good room where everyone's kind of on the same page. But yeah, I mean, some of this stuff makes me think about. I also liken it back to, I think, some of the stuff we talked about in previous calls. That Anna Halpern quote. It's like, artists evoke the art within us all, and how, in a way, all all art is sort of a collaborative effort between the artist and the audience. When we talk about that notion that, we all have our subjective conscious experience of the world, and we each craft a narrative out of the art that someone else makes. So, and that becomes even more, like I said, in participatory art, where you know the audience is a character and you're facilitating a story around them. It becomes even more relevant to exactly sort of what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, in that case, you're really reliant on others that others to co-create this piece with you. And it just made me wonder about, now that you brought this up, the difference between the individual artist, let's say a painter or a photographer, um, somebody that does still lifes or something. Does that rule still hold? You want to bring the best out of the other person in a collaborative, let's say theater event, or collaborative art. And you mentioned a writing room. How does that apply if you're an individual artist? I, I used to be a photographer. I still do some of that, and the thing I like about it is that I don't have to collaborate with anybody. I because I find that sometimes difficult. I want my own way. I like the solitude of creating without having to check in with people.
I don't know. Because I was struck by what you said, Tony, in the empathy talk, how you go to the doctor and you don't want the doctor to empathize with you. You just want them to cure you.
No.
I I thought that was very interesting, and I know other people like that. And so I mean, there's room for all of us here.
Yeah.
So maybe the work of the individual artist, say the photographer or even a writer or painter, their collaboration might look different than what we're discussing. So when you're taking photographs, who are you collaborating with? You're collaborating with another aspect of yourself. You're collaborating with your subject,
Hmm.
with your vision. What are you trying to get across? Like, what are you trying to say?
Yeah, I thought about that in terms of, like, a painting and a photograph, and in terms of some of my work on what it means to be an artist. And I guess it's sort of, like I said, we know you can't really sort of represent a thing in itself independent of people's perceptions of it. So in a way, I think an artist, like a painter, is sort of trying to present their perspective of the thing they're painting. And sometimes an artist is trying to be sort of photorealistic, and other times they're trying to convey that the feeling that they have when they're looking at it, like impressionists or things that aren't trying to be photoreal, but because and that's sort of acknowledging that thing that it's our narrative experience or our artistic experience is rooted in all the sort of conscious connections we draw to it. So your experience of a thing is unique, and in a way, I think as an artist, we try to convey that to other folks, but also with the understanding that they're going to have their own sort of unique understanding of it, and that we're trying to facilitate that maybe more than anything.
And I also think that besides the conscious connection that we're making, I think there's this unconscious connection that we bring to the piece and give it meaning or value, much like, stories that we tell ourselves or say that's true about me. Some, we have conscious connections, but we have a lot of unconscious connections that come not just from the thought and the word, but also from, the felt sense through the body, which I think that meaning is when we experience, we have no idea how much we bring in through our body, not just our head and our eyes. So often we don't, we're so in a Western culture, we are so much more disconnected from that felt sense of.
I certainly am. Yeah.
So that's a lot of my work too, I guess, in art and in grief activism is working those muscles of somatically of how is this hitting me, and what does it mean to me inside before it gets to this place, and I give it words and meaning, like, oh, this means I am this way. So it's an interesting I don't know, frontier for me.
Yeah, it makes me think about the idea of mindfulness, that and when you say intention, that really speaks to mindfulness, paying attention on purpose, paying attention on purpose to what's coming up in you. You don't want to filter out what might be important. So you pay attention on purpose to the person in front of you, but also to your own sensory experience. And you acknowledge what you feel. You don't dismiss it. You can decide what you want to do with it. That might be the creative part. I have this feeling. I may not want to represent it, or I may not want to say to another person what I'm really feeling, but I can't deny I'm feeling this, or I think this at this point. And this gets into the writing prompt in narrative medicine, where we encourage people to keep an open mind, not only to what other people are saying, but what's coming up in them, and so that you could represent what you've just experienced on paper, but it really has to come up in yourself, and then you can make a decision whether or not you want to reveal what just came up.
And that makes me think of how do we hold two maybe seemingly disparate things at the same time? Your thought and feeling, which I might share, and another thought and feeling that's totally opposite. How do I hold that at the same time? This is hard.
It's interesting. Yeah, I was thinking, artists and storytellers in a lot of ways, one of the biggest important things that they do is direct audience's attention. Whether it's a story, it's like, we're directing them to what with these characters and these parts of their worlds and lives. And I suppose that's really related to grief and therapy too. I know we probably haven't talked about it too much on this show yet, but I've said, for me personally, I am very good and probably too good at like compartmentalizing and sort of just pushing out of my head things that I don't want to deal with in ways that I don't think is always healthy. And so when I am in therapy, I've sort of observed that for me, what is most important is that a good therapist will force me to go to those places that I won't otherwise. So in a way, their job is also directing my attention. They're directing my attention to the things that I don't want to deal with, but have to deal with to better function, to better process the things in my life that I need to deal with. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, good art does that. Good art directs you to something that you may not have, it's not totally obvious in a circumstance or a story, or it's a little distasteful yet totally human, or it's a big trauma that individuals experience, or even communities or groups or generations. And then when you're exposed to that, it invites you to interact with it and to have a feeling about it, an opinion about it, and then ask yourself, am I changed through that? And so often I think change is almost like, it's like a little death. We don't like change. We're afraid of death. We don't like it.
Emmett, I wanted to get back to something before I forget. What you just said about compartmentalizing
Mm.
and the therapist perhaps forcing you to not do that quite so much. And it made me wonder if your choice of art, and I'm not sure that this is your primary choice, but it seems to be what you're heavily involved with right now, participatory art, where it's up to the others to create the art. You are a facilitator. You're a facilitator of their art. I guess what I was wondering is, does this prevent you from, or is this in service of your stated tendency to compartmentalize? That if you brought up what was inside of you, maybe you'd be doing something different than participatory art. And so, do you leave it up to others to create?
That's a really interesting question. There is, I will say that, like, I've said sometimes, or thought that I wonder if I could be a better artist if I could more readily access the traumas and the things that I go out of my way to not process, and in an intentional way, I guess, sort of uh talk about that in the work that I do, and I guess what's really interesting about this is, like, I've probably said it in a previous call, but like, the term role playing originated in therapy, in therapeutic circles. Now there's tabletop role playing and live action role play and all, and these different, that are primarily for entertainment. But, and again, I've got LARP friends who are therapists who say that, of course, LARP and role play, this kind of creative role playing, aren't a replacement for actual therapy, but for some people they can be. And I I forget, you can tell me if I mentioned this, but like, before, but I'm a person, I won't get into a ton of details on it, but like, these days in my life, I have real difficulty uh crying, just ever, alone. I'm not embarrassed to, it's just, there's whatever it is, And but you know, at the LARP that I do, when I had some characters sort of permanently die, you know, I was able to cry there. And so I think in a way, like, I'm trying to create these organic situations where I trick myself into having those experiences that I can't as intentionally get to, you know. If that makes any sense. Like, you know,
No,
I
mm,
I essentially, you know, I've said sometimes that like part of me wants to be a better performer, not because that's my intention to do that as a for a living, but that, you know, engage with sort of role playing or storytelling situations where I fully become that character in as much as that's possible, you know, and disconnect from some of the other aspects of my life and get, and you know, and maybe sometimes go to places that uh I wouldn't or couldn't in another context. You know, and it's, so there's that. And then, you know, it's just also, and then because again, a lot of what I do is co-creative, so it's really exciting to see what the other people are bringing to it. And there's always newness and this freshness because I can't, you know, you know, a lot of writers will say like, you know, oh, I went into this sort of state where like the characters were speaking through me, like I was a medium and I was not controlling it. And the interesting thing about doing this sort of participatory interactive art where uh people play characters and you're building the scenes from within the scenes by having conversations is, you know, those characters, you know, well, they're not speaking on their own, but they're speaking independently of you. And so it forces you to there's a concept in LARP called bleed, and it involves, and this probably comes up in acting as well, maybe in the same name, maybe a different one, but where, you know, if you do that so successfully, it can become difficult to separate the feelings of the character from your own feelings, you know, and then that could, you know, if you had a difficult encounter with a person playing a character, that can bleed over into your real life with that person. So that's, I mean, that's obviously sort of maybe a downside of that level of immersion if you're not equipped to sort of handle it. But, and I think that's also why it's a lot of times important for LARP and tabletop to sort of like uh, ritualistically, liminally transition from the world into the game and then out
Mm,
again. And, you know,
mm.
that tends to be important. But yeah, right. And you were asking, you know, what does that look like? Yeah, because I think uh, I've also joked, you know, I think we talked about like in my earliest days of this sort of participatory role playing based sort of art that I've done in the earliest days, you know, there's a lot of me playing characters on Twitter. Like I made Twitter accounts for the different characters in the web series we were making, and I played those characters in real time in text, talking to each other and talking to the fans. And you know, I joked, but it's not even really a joke either. Like I but I joked like, oh, it was easier and more comfortable
Mm.
playing other people on social media than me and playing me. And I think that comes into play here with what I'm talking about too, where it's sort of sometimes when I have this removal of this isn't me, I can feel a little more comfortable going to emotional places or places that I don't. It's an interesting place where you can experiment with feelings and situations that uh you know are scarier for whatever reason, maybe in your actual life. And
it really strikes me that both of you, my perspective, are talking about this artificial construct of self, this idea that we are ourselves and other people are themselves, and that we have to distinguish between what are our feelings and what are the character's feelings. That seems really arbitrary to me.
Mm.
And this idea of bleed, I guess I was wondering, is it a condition or is it a problem? You know, is it just
Um,
another way to create art? You know, allowing the characters to bleed through you onto the page or onto the stage, onto a LARP representation.
yeah, I mean, I suppose there could also be positively, right? It can build community and build your relationships with the other people who we're engaging with it in a positive way. It's um
Mm,
right. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess it's probably true that some performers can just, turn it on and say the lines and seem like they're being authentic, and then maybe others really don't know how to do it without going to that place, without like immersing in the character that much.